Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get rolling in about 30 seconds if you want to find your way to coffee and your seat. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Aaron Sizer. I'm a program director for the Gady Institute for the Liberal Arts. Thanks for being here this afternoon. I'd share just a couple of program notes before we begin, in case you are joining us for the first time. Our format in this session will be a little different from a typical public lecture. We'll hear first from our speaker. We'll take a little break, and then we'll reconvene for some conversation, first at tables and then in the larger room. All told, that has us together until probably about 5:15 this evening. Related to that, I want to give a special welcome and encouragement to the students in this room. This conversation is as much for you as for anyone. We're the ones here on the stage, we're the ones in the business casual attire, but your perspectives are in many ways the most valuable. So please, Westmont students, if you can swing it, please plan to stick around for the discussion and give us the gift of your voice. Well, I'm glad that all of you have joined us this afternoon and this weekend to explore new ways to organize the project of teaching and learning that better account for our situation in the natural world. And I'm delighted this afternoon to introduce you to someone who has spent his career doing just that. Dr. Jeffrey Bilbro is a writer and professor of English who has taught at Spring Arbor University and Grove City College. He hails originally from Washington State and holds a PhD in English from Baylor University. He's worked extensively in the area of ecological literature, and especially in its interaction with Christianity in the American context. But that narrow speciality is not at all narrow, as many in this room will know. To explore what flourishing means in a particular ecology is often an invitation to wonder what flourishing might mean in every ecology. In Dr. Bilbro's case, those questions have taken him into a broad array of not strictly literary pursuits. He writes for Front Porch Republic, a wide-ranging online journal that closely attends to place, natural limits, governance, and stewardship. He contributes to the Liberating Arts, a multi-institutional project that examines how liberal education can contribute to human flourishing for individuals and for communities. His most recent book is Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news, which invites readers into a broader examination of time and history, what news does to and for us. Those of you who know Dr. Bilbro's work might know it through his engagement with another writer who thinks expansively about humans in the natural world. Dr. Bilbro is the editor or the author of 3 books on Wendell Berry, whose career and life have modeled some of the many ways that close attention to our surroundings might provoke us to live and work and learn and belong differently. Of direct interest to this gathering might be Dr. Bilbro's 2017 volume, Wendell Berry and Higher Education, Cultivating Virtues of Place. If you regard Wendell Berry as a modern prophet, as well you might, Dr. Bilbro has been an unusually insightful and practical interpreter of that prophetic voice for those who care about how we're formed as teachers and learners and how our formation inspires and equips others. We look forward to what Jeff will bring us. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thanks very much, Aaron. Thanks to Chris as well for putting this on. So it's been a delight to be a part of it so far this weekend. Yeah, and if I can just riff on Wendell Berry for 40 minutes, then I think that's pretty good, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the liberal arts from the perspective of what they might offer us, but also what they might not offer us. And I want to begin by offering a kind of critique, I suppose, of one form of public defense of liberal arts education, which is it's a friendly critique, I might be too mean. And this is the form it takes when tech company executives or other CEO types explain how their companies love to hire graduates from liberal arts colleges. And these testimonies tend to reassure prospective students. You know, I've definitely said things along these lines to students or their parents in my office. But sometimes you get these op-eds that are extolling liberal arts colleges' ROI, or insist that liberal arts do align with employer needs, or studies that demonstrate that a liberal arts education is a practical investment. Recently, the Secretary of Education put out a kind of controversial tweet along these lines, something about an education that aligns, with workforce needs of the future or something. And again, I think there's some truth to these, but my concern is that they tend to beg the question, to use a much abused phrase, but I think I'm using the right sense this time. The end or goal of liberal education maybe isn't career success or private enrichment or even some kind of nebulous social impact. Its ultimate aim shouldn't be to make critical thinkers who can be valuable employees and do exciting work in a rapidly changing knowledge economy, even if that is a particular end that sometimes happens. Rather, I want to say that liberal education should aim to turn students' souls away from themselves and their own self-interests and toward the common good of their communities and their places. It should be an education that liberates students to love and belong well. Thus, contrary to the current spate of liberal education will make you a wealthy tech worker essay, one measure of a successful liberal education may be that it renders students reluctant to participate in all facets of such an economy. And I'll come back to that a little bit at the end. So one caveat, I admit this is a little contrarian, and if you want a more practical defense of liberal education, I think Richard Detwather's Evidence Liberal Arts Need is a pretty good book that gives a lot of very pragmatic benefits that come from a liberal education. But again, I want to take a step back from those kind of defenses and offer a different angle on what exactly liberal education offers, in particular in light of our theme this weekend. And I want to begin by thinking about two assumptions that are implicit in these kinds of defenses, right? Liberal education will make you a better worker in a knowledge economy, and kind of unpack them. The first one is that maybe the best approach to big existential social problems like ecological degradation or social injustice might be big solutions and innovative tech. Right? Maybe we need big solutions to address big problems. And if that's the case, then we do need to educate people who are going to be really good tech workers or policy wonks or effective activists, right? People who have a big impact, maybe even global leaders. And yet, perhaps, sometimes, big problems are best addressed not through big systemic solutions, but through a myriad of little, local approaches that require creative and faithful work. And in this case, an education to prepare students to take up the work of loving care might include specialized training, right? It might include a STEM discipline or public policy or something, but it's also going to need to be rooted in other values and oriented toward more complex ends. So to the extent that we have a culture that's built on individual achievement, built on extracting goods for private consumption and enjoyment, then tech improvements tend to amplify these values rather than fundamentally improve the health of our ecosystems. So the second flawed assumption behind these appeals, again, is the fact, or is the idea, and this is actually similar to Athena's talk last night, that the prudent response to scarcity and risk is to acquire the resources needed to secure your own individual existence and comfort. And again, students understandably want to find a job that's not going to be disrupted by AI or disrupted by shifting economy, and an education that promises critical thinking, whatever that means, and an ability to learn and adapt to new tasks seems like a good personal investment, okay? However, justifying education in these terms appeals to short-sighted and selfish impulses. And they aren't even effective in responding to the kind of multifaceted and distributed risks that are posed by ecological destruction and its effects, right? When our common home is threatened by irresponsible and destructive behavior, then we're going to need people to act as redemptive agents in their communities and places. And a true liberal arts education, as its name implies, should be an education for precisely this kind of liberality, this kind of generous service to the common good. Yet universities as they currently exist, whether in their liberal arts variants or not, unfortunately, tend to turn students away from their places and from the common good, and instead toward an abstraction known as a career. And Steve quoted this in his talk earlier this afternoon, but Wes Jackson has this great line that upward mobility is now the only major that universities offer. And Wendell Berry's been talking about this with Wes and others for decades. And as Berry sort of expands on Jackson's claim, he says that upward mobility, as we are now seeing, implies downward mobility, just as it has always implied lateral mobility. It implies, in fact, social instability, ecological oblivion, and economic insecurity. Elsewhere, Berry kind of elaborates on this through a distinction made by his friend or his teacher, Wallace Stegner, between boomers, which is not an age group, but a kind of a group that Stegner sees in those who settled the West, the American West, who are characterized by a kind of restless search for better career opportunities and better places. And the opposite group that Stegner proposes are the stickers. Stegner identifies boomers as those who came to the West looking to get rich. They were willing to damage the land and its existing communities for a quick profit. And then once they'd extracted all they could get from a place, a mine, a forest, a farm, they would move on to a more abundant place. But as Berry notes, not all who came to American places came to plunder and run. Some came to stay or came with the hope of staying, and these Stegner called stickers or nesters. So these are people who come looking to inhabit a place. And again, maybe they didn't have a place for all kinds of reasons. I think with climate change, we're seeing many more people who have become displaced. But there's still an opportunity to be a sticker, right, to stick someplace. And to the extent that universities promise prospective students dynamic, lucrative careers in the knowledge economy, they tend to shape them into boomers, into individuals who will be predisposed to move from job to job in the service of their careers. And yet, as Berry warns, you cannot live in a career. I'm going to quote here from a 2007 commencement address he gave when he concluded with this exhortation to the graduates. You must refuse to accept the common delusion that a career is an adequate context for a life. The logic of success insinuates that self-enlargement is your only responsibility, and that any job, any career will be satisfying if you succeed in it. But I can tell you on the authority of much evidence that a lot of people, highly successful by that logic, are painfully dissatisfied. And I can tell you further that you cannot live in a career and that satisfaction can come only from your life. To give satisfaction, your life will have to be lived in a family, a neighborhood, a community, an ecosystem, a watershed, a place, meeting your responsibilities to all those things to which you belong. But unfortunately, all these things to which we belong suffer when we live our lives in ways that deny and evade these responsibilities. So I want to spend this afternoon thinking about how a liberal arts education could, in contrast to the way that education tends to work, form students to fulfill these responsibilities. And to do so, I want to think about two questions. The first is, why has contemporary American culture largely replaced this broader context of a life that's embedded in a common good, with a more narrow notion of a career? And then the second, which I'll spend more time on, is this. If you wanted to recover an education worthy of a life, what might students need to know to dwell responsibly in their membership, or memberships, really, and to wisely tend these common goods? So the first question, I think this idea that a life has been narrowed to a career is accompanied and reciprocally caused, perhaps, by a kind of curricular narrowing, as colleges offer more specialized and professional degree tracks. In his essay, Lost to the University, Berry argues that one way to ground a more responsible education would be to return to the ancient understanding of knowledge as a tree. Reimagining knowledge through this metaphor might remind us to pay attention to the ways that knowledge connects and coheres, which is a particularly important reminder in an individualized and specialized age. This is Barry on this tree image. He says, "The tree for many hundreds of years seems to have come almost naturally to mind when we have sought to describe the form of knowledge. If we represent knowledge as a tree, we know that things that are divided are yet connected. We know that to observe the divisions and to ignore the connections is to destroy the tree. The history of modern education may be the history of the loss of this image and of its replacement by the pattern of the industrial machine, which subsists upon division, and by industrial economics, publish or perish, which is meaningless apart from division." This is a rather bleak image of disintegration, but I think it helps to explain the kinds of justifications for liberal education that I cited at the outset. Rather than judging the success of an education by appealing to how it shapes graduates to serve the common good, these kinds of defenses retreat to individual, self-interested, specialized goods. Knowledge is no longer rooted in and accountable to a broader community. It's been reduced to an individual commodity to be bought and sold. In a parallel vein, the Catholic philosopher Alistair MacIntyre traces how this kind of narrow, specialized understanding of knowledge came to dominate contemporary universities. By analogy, MacIntyre points to the failure of early modern encyclopedias, which were originally intended and aspired to capture a unified vision of the world, but then ultimately became mere reference books. MacIntyre writes that inquiry had finally become fragmented into a series of independent, specialized professional activities whose results could, so it seemed, find no place as parts in any whole. Medieval and Renaissance metaphors such as those of a tree of knowledge or a house of knowledge lost their application, right? So instead of trying to map knowledge in a cohesive fashion, we settled for just studying individual, discrete, specialized topics. In similar fashion, universities ceased to recognize moral and theological truth as objects of substantive inquiry, and instead relegated them to the realm of privatized belief. Questions of truth, as distinct from the psychological or social scientific study of morals and religion, became matter for private allegiances, not to be accorded such formal badges of academic recognition. And yet, MacIntyre, at the end of this book, he finds paradoxical grounds for hope in the outside stresses that have forced universities to more explicitly justify their continued existence and privileges. So he says that as insofar as defenders of the status quo have responded with stuttering ineptitudes to the criticisms and crises confronting higher education, but there's perhaps a real opportunity for liberal arts colleges to offer a more robust account of what we're after and of what an education might offer students. MacIntyre's recommendation is to commit to be a place where conceptions of and standards of rational justification are elaborated, put to work, and themselves rationally evaluated. And in this way, the wider society might learn from universities how to conduct debates well. And in order to become such a place, he argues, and I think he's right, that we must frankly ask and pursue ultimate questions. I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes, but questions such as, what are X's for, right? What particular goods does this kind of specialized study that we're inducting our students into serve? So what are the broader implications of the specialized knowledge that we are passing on? And these are precisely the kind of teleological questions that a well-conceived core curriculum endeavors to form students to ask. One of the reasons that academia as a whole tends to withdraw from this task, we've seen the kind of watering down of a common core curriculum in various ways, is that it requires, in some sense, a pretty high degree of agreement about what is fundamental and what it forms the trunk of the tree of knowledge. And as these kinds of community agreements have been lost, right, we tend to retreat into our disciplinary specializations. And yet, difficult as they may be, particularly in a pluralistic society, these debates about what students need to know remain fundamental and necessary. We can't dodge them. A liberal arts college cannot be content to merely teach students specialized information and discrete skills. It must also equip them to imagine the common good that their knowledge should serve and help them develop the practical wisdom that is needed to match their efforts to that end. And I'll come back to that a little bit in a few minutes. But I want to turn now to that second question. What kind of curriculum might accomplish these tasks and prepare students to actually think about how specialized knowledge could or might not serve the common good. To return to this metaphor of knowledge as a rooted tree, colleges must first of all provide their students with a unified trunk of knowledge, a clear sense of the way that the various disciplines cohere. As Barry puts it, the need for broadly informed human judgment requires inescapably an education that is broad and basic. Such an education would begin by leading students up the trunk of this tree, and then once they've grasped the trunk, it would guide them into their more specialized professions. As Barry explains, the work that should and can unify a university is that of deciding what a student should be required to learn, what studies constitute the trunk of a person's education. And again, these are difficult questions, but I think if members of a particular institution cannot decide what it should be required of students, then it's not really fair to expect 18-year-old freshmen to know what they need to know, right? How I wouldn't have known at that age. So neglecting a common core curriculum actually reinforces cultural assumptions that the real purpose of an education is merely to cater to the student and to prepare them for whatever specialized career they already want to pursue. In particular, I want to spend some time here thinking about what goods this common education might provide students. And I think to begin with, I want to say that a liberal arts curriculum is not sufficient to do all the work that I'm going to suggest I can help with. Okay, so there's kind of a caveat here. Because the standard by which we need to judge our learning and work is ultimately found outside of the campus boundaries. It's found in the ground in which the tree of knowledge is rooted. So our learning and work need to be rooted to some extent literally and not just metaphorically in our places and our communities, right? So this problem of kind of local adaptation of the institution to its place is paramount. Barry calls this the standard to which our learning must be faithful, the life and health of the world, which is a fairly demanding standard. Elsewhere, he calls this the great economy, and then in conversation with Wes Jackson, Wes says, you got to call it the kingdom of God. That's the only thing that's comprehensive enough to name this kind of standard by which our learning will be judged. And this is a much more comprehensive standard than whether students can get a job, the kind of career success outcomes that universities tend to publish to their prospective students. Because the kingdom of God is concerned with the suffering of our wounded neighbor, the groaning of creation, the fall of each sparrow, right? The kingdom is concerned with this world and the next. As Barry notes, it includes everything. So the task of making our knowledge and work faithful and responsible to everything is a task that is never going to be complete. And yet, ultimately, I think such work requires a healthy imagination, one that's been formed to see the connections between our lives and work and everything. So, with that caveat, let's think a little bit about what it can do, what a common curriculum might do, even if it can't fully achieve that outcome in a way that could be assessed. Envisioning knowledge as a rooted tree should at least lead us to cultivate an ongoing work of imaginative judgment that mediates between two essential standards, between an internal one and an external one. And by internal, I mean whether the work that we're doing, the learning that we're doing, is good as such in and of itself. So in my discipline of English, we might ask, is this poem good according to certain internal standards that the community of poets agree upon, right? Is this computer program elegant and efficient? Does it accomplish its tasks? Is this philosophical argument logically valid? These are disciplinary questions, right? And they're important. But they aren't sufficient for judging then whether what we're making with our students will serve this common good. So we also need to form students to ask if an object is good according to this external standard. Does this poem, in some fashion, foster vibrant communities? How will this computer program affect our lives and economies? Is this philosophical argument based on true premises? What's its effect in the world? These are difficult questions, right? And answering them requires both specialized knowledge and broadly formed knowledge. The specialization teaches us to know whether a given object is good as such, while the tree's trunk, the common knowledge, and the context in which it's rooted help us to judge the broader effects of this object on its communities. But I think teaching students to make this kind of double judgment is essential if our graduates are going to serve the health of their places. Again, as Wendell argues, if for the sake of its own health, a university must be interested in the question of the truth of what it teaches, then for the sake of the world's health, it must be interested in the fate of that truth and the uses made of it in the world. It must want to know where its graduates live, where they work, and what they do. And without the ability to judge broadly, Barry quips, a good forgerer has as valid a claim to our respect as a good artist. So that's the nub of the problem. And again, despite the importance of this work, education's tended increasingly to ignore this double obligation in this retreat to specialization. So the tendency within the academy is to focus only on how to make a poem, a computer program, a bridge that is technically good, and not how to judge what its effects might be, right? And on the one hand, I think this makes sense for a variety of reasons. Increasing specialization is caused in part by the burgeoning knowledge within particular fields. It's very hard to cover all that students need within specialized career paths in 4 years, and so there's a tendency to weed out these non-essential courses. I do want surgeons who can, do surgery. I get that. But on the other hand, Barry points out that one reason for the specialization might be, in fact, to avoid the potentially embarrassing conflict between a broadly informed judgment and the specialized career for which students are being prepared. Right? Teachers of advertising techniques, for example, this is Barry, could ill afford for their students to realize that they are learning the arts of lying and seduction. So there's multiple potential reasons for this specialization. And I think even even institutions that aspire to form students to take this doubleness seriously must acknowledge that questions about the effects of our work on the common good are never finally answerable. And that's why it's so important to cultivate healthy, vibrant imaginations. Right? It's not so much a set of content that students need to master as a habit of mind and a well-furnished imagination. Because these things students will continue to form and grow their whole lives, right? Again, this is Barry. The imagination is in the world, is at work in it, is necessary to it, and is correctable by it. This is what it means to be adaptable or resilient. This correcting of imagination by experience is inescapable, necessary, and endless, as is the correcting of experience by imagination. This is the great general work of criticism to which we are all called. One of the most profound of human needs is for the truth of imagination to prove itself in every life and place in the world, and for the truth of the world's lives and places to be proved in imagination. So this is the ongoing work of imagination, a work that's ultimately rooted in a love for the common good that I think should be at the heart of a liberal education. Institutions and faculty who are committed to liberal education then need to pay careful attention to forming this kind of rooted imagination. Imaginations that can guide students as they attempt to make their learning and their work serve the health of their places. Okay, I want to conclude this last section by trying to answer from one very particular perspective the million-dollar question: how do you actually do this? How do you lead students to the trunk of the tree in a way that forms this kind of imagination? And I think the answers are numerous. Hopefully this is one of the things we can talk about afterwards. But one of the primary tasks of a rooted and liberal education should be to tell better stories and provide students with a richer imagination of the good according to which they can judge their lives and their work. One place this could begin, I think, is in alumni magazines and university websites. What kind of alumni accomplishments are we profiling? I think it would be refreshingly countercultural if marketing departments included profiles of alumni who courageously persevere in very ordinary work and accomplish it with skill and render a beautiful life from mundane service. We don't have to just profile the CEOs or the people who make a lot of money. And as a faculty person, I think, talking with prospective students and their parents, I want to find ways to praise the lives of faithful students from my graduates and not just, this grad got this job, right? So it's also the stories we tell our students. But I want to spend most of the time here on this curricular example, and this is not a prescription or a best practice, it's just one way this is filtered down to the way that I approach a course that I teach. So I'm a literature professor. The last two, both my colleges, I've had the opportunity to teach the lit class that all students from across the college take. It's a required course. Maybe this seems odd to think about a lit class as a training for the common good. It might seem odd to look at these old texts for guidance regarding how to live well in the midst of, very contemporary problems. And yet I've been encouraged in this by a kind of offhand remark that Wendell makes at the beginning of Life is a Miracle. That's his kind of justification for spending this book on modern science and the oversimplifications of commercialized science, as he calls it, by spending much of this book talking about a Shakespeare play of all things, King Lear. And he says, I love this line, he says that human hope may always have resided in our ability, in time of need, to return to our cultural landmarks and reorient ourselves. That hope depends upon us going back to what wisdom has been passed down to us and maybe reorienting, restarting. So I try to approach these old stories in that fashion. And I've kind of selected the texts that we read to focus on questions of the proper end of knowledge, right? Let's think about how people have used knowledge in ways that maybe have gone astray, that have degraded the common good. Not always ecologically, but sometimes. And I teach stories such as Homer's Odyssey, Dante's Divine Comedy, Milton's Paradise Lost, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Jhumpa Lahiri's Unaccustomed Earth, and others. And then during the last week of the semester, I conclude with Wendell Berry's Remembering, which is kind of fun because it makes allusions to many of these texts, and students can kind of see the threads we've been discussing come together. But just to give you a couple of examples of how I work through these texts, when we talk about the Odyssey, students watch Odysseus very haltingly learn to use his craft and his cunning, right, his specialized skills, not just to accomplish military exploits or to increase his fame and glory, which are some things that he struggles with, but eventually and finally to restore domestic order. There's this beautiful image near the end of Homer's story when Odysseus arrives home and Penelope, his wife, is testing his identity, and she proposes to move their bed outside their room, and Odysseus says, "It's impossible, because I built the bed, and it's made out of an olive tree that's rooted in the ground." And the Greek uses this word that he built this bed with his craft, right? This is the same craft with which Odysseus builds the Trojan horse, and with which he comes up with all these cunning military stratagems. But he's now recommitting to use these intellectual gifts that have been used rather promiscuously to tend the order of his domestic oikos, his ecology, his economy, right, the home. And there's this other great scene of recognition where Odysseus is meeting his father, Laertes, and his father is wearing armor to go out to battle against the weeds and the sticks and thorns that are afflicting his orchard, right? So he's doing battle in defense of these trees. And Odysseus identifies himself to his father because he knows all the trees there in the orchard. And I think there's this sense at the end of the Odyssey that Homer is suggesting that the true measure of wisdom, the true measure of a life well lived, is not the honor and fame that is won by a successful career, but the lives that might be blessed by a thriving domestic economy. And then we turn to the Divine Comedy. My students come to know this pilgrim who's kind of a sinner, right? Who's invested his energies in a political career, political activism, you might say, that then crumbled when he's exiled. And when his political ambitions are thwarted, when he knows that he can no longer effect the kind of change he aimed to, he's then tempted to seek immortality through his poetic art, right? To have a career. But as he journeys through hell, Dante learns that those who make themselves eternal through literature still spend eternity divided from God. And so Dante seeks eventually to curb his talent that it not run where virtue does not guide. In other words, Dante is gradually learning to use his poetic gifts not to achieve wealth or a satisfying career, but in fact to inspire others to pursue friendship with God. And this, for Dante, is the final end of human liberty. It's the final end of a liberal education. Those who use their freedom to cultivate friendship with their neighbors and their Creator have learned to use their freedom well. And remember, freedom and friendship are etymologically linked. This theme continues in Paradise Lost. Satan famously pursues knowledge and individual success without taking thought for how his choices will affect his place. Satan says the mind is its own place and in itself can make a heaven of hell a hell of heaven. Right? And yet as he acts on this belief, he finds himself increasingly corrupted and enslaved rather than freed. Satan's a master rhetorician, right? He's very good at deceiving himself and others. But as we walk through the poem, we discuss the consequences for Satan, for Adam, for Eve, for the whole cosmos, when he puts his brilliant mind in the service of his ego rather than the service of his community. And as Satan eventually confesses, the fruit of his self-serving use of knowledge. He says, which way I fly is hell, myself am hell, right? It's a very striking reversal of his earlier exaltation of himself. And after his enticements induce Adam and Eve to join him in a damned pursuit of knowledge, they too commit themselves to that pursuit of learning, which might, as Milton writes in On Education, repair the ruin of our first parents. This vision of education as an opportunity to kind of ameliorate the effects of the fall, to participate in this redemption. Again, such an education teaches students how to use their freedom and their skills and their gifts rightly, not to pursue their own interests, but to make a home for themselves and others in a world that sin, our own sin, has made inhospitable. So I think these visions of membership and shalom help guide and motivate my students as they seek to apply the more specialized knowledge that they're gaining in their majors. The imaginative vision such stories portray equips students to ask vital questions, such as, what are the effects of my work? What does my home need to become healthy? Does my work tend to this health? And I think the ability to ask these questions and then live out responsible answers to them may be the true mark of liberally educated people, people who are free to use their knowledge to serve the good of their beloved places. And to come back to my opening examples, I think one of the key outcomes of this class that I teach and of this robust core curriculum more broadly is that it might lead graduates to say no to certain uses of their knowledge. I hope they will not be mere slaves of their employers, but will be free to say, no, I'm not going to tell that lie in this marketing copy. No, I'm not going to design this program to addict its users. No, I'm not going to source this product from an exploitative manufacturer. No, I'm not going to mistreat my subordinates. Right? They're not going to just serve the bottom line. Instead, they will have become free to use their learning to serve the common good. And again, we should all hope, I certainly hope for my students, I hope for myself, right, that a college education can equip students to make a living even in a broken and unjust economy. But we must never forget that a liberal education is priceless, and in fact, it's free. And again, I get this from Barry. Barry writes that to make a commodity of education is to work its ruin. For when we put a price on it, we both reduce its value and blind the recipient to the obligations that always accompany good gifts, namely to use them well and to hand them on unimpaired. To make a commodity of education, then, is inevitably to make a kind of weapon of it, because when it's disassociated from the sense of obligation, it can be put directly to the service of greed. So, money is going to change hands, right, between our students and our institutions. And that's necessary and good, but we must remember and remind them, I think, that a liberal education is not a commodity that can be purchased, but a gift to be gratefully received and then responsibly used. So the final end of a liberal education should not be to make students more profitable workers in a knowledge economy. And in fact, the double judgment that I've suggested lies at the core of a liberated imagination, right? This ability to ask not only is what I'm working on good, but also are its effects good, might make for less pliant, less profitable sometimes workers. If we just want to churn out profitable workers, then a servile education would suffice. By contrast, a liberal education seeks to turn students' souls toward the common good, even and especially when the fate of that good seems vulnerable and uncertain. It seeks to form not mere employees, but committed community members. East of Eden, our efforts will always be marked by frustration and failure, but a liberal education shapes students' imaginations so they might long to mend the threads of a frayed world. It invites them to recognize that their vocation, regardless of what their careers might entail, is to use their knowledge to love and serve their neighbors, to form abiding friendships, and to tend the health of our common home. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for those good words. It is about 4:15 now. We will take until, let's say, 4:25 to break and refresh our coffee and use the restroom and reconvene for some conversation. So take about 10 minutes, and we'll see you back here. Well, friends, if I can bring us back together, we have maybe another 25 minutes for conversation with our speaker, Jeff Bilbro, this afternoon. I will take the moderator's privilege of asking the first question, then I'll open it up for you to ask questions and continue the conversation. Jeff, one of the things that has occurred to me powerfully in the last couple of days is that we have been setting up these really interesting sort of binaries having to do with higher education. Are we educating for something like competition, or are we educating for something like collaboration? Are we educating for self-interest, or are we educating for love? Are we educating for speed, or are we educating for slowness? And it strikes me in your talk that we have another evocative possibility here. Are we educating for placidness, or are we educating for displacement? Placement or displacement might be the cleaner way of saying that. Are we giving students tools to find their place in the world and commit to that place and see that place and love that place? Or are we participating in their training for a life of bouncing around and pursuing something as arid as a career versus a life? And it occurs to me as I think about that, that there is a lot of displacement that happens in the undergraduate years. For a lot of students, they are being picked up out of their community of origin for the first time, encountering an entirely new community, being given tools that will send them off into more chapters of displacement as they go to graduate school, as they pursue a first and second and third career, all of which might be accompanied by a geographical move. It sometimes seems to me like students are blowing past us at 1,000 miles an hour and are only going to accelerate once they get out the door. And the question I would have for you is, what possibilities do you see in the midst of a format of education that can be very displacing for developing tools for homemaking, developing tools for rootedness, developing tools for placidness, given that students are with us only for a short time and are probably being displaced in order to be with us?
Yeah, and maybe make the question worse, are being educated by people who are themselves displaced in a sense. I don't think I realized when I decided to go to grad school that would mean I would have, like 2 options for where I could get a job, and neither one of them would be close to my family. And then I would lose my job and have to be displaced again, And there's these, academia famously tends to create uprooted people. So yeah, there's definitely some tension. There's some tension in my life being a guy who talks about Wendell and is the only person of my extended family who lives, more than 20 minutes from my parents. But I think I take great comfort from something that Tanya Berry says, quoting Gary Snyder, that even people who didn't inherit a place can stop someplace. And I think for many of my students, they don't come from coherent places. They come from various kinds of displacement already. So some of them do come from pretty coherent, embedded communities, but many of them come from, their families have moved around. Maybe they've been migratory through no choice of their own. And for many of them, a college experience is a kind of one of their first experiences of a walkable community where people share meals together. They see people outside. There's like a kind of broader community of people who kind of know each other. And that oftentimes, especially with a little bit of conversation and unpacking, can become a kind of catalyst for them to then want to establish themselves in a more rooted place, in a more rooted manner of life. Maybe live in a walkable place or a bikeable place. Maybe be intentional about sharing meals with friends when they graduate. Maybe reprioritize what they're looking for once they leave college. So I like to imagine that for all of its weird dynamics, college is not multi-generational. College, you go back to your alma mater after you graduate 5 or 6 years, and it's a different place because all the people who made it the place it was when you were there are dispersed. So college is not a regular place. It's a very weird place. But be that as it may, it can, I think, ideally function as a kind of greenhouse where students are kind of allowed to flourish in a community and then be transplanted into communities that hopefully they can bless. So it takes some work to kind of push back against all those tendencies that you just outlined, Aaron. But I think if we're thoughtful about it, we can help our students to narrate their college experience as a preparation for homemaking or earthkeeping or inhabiting communities that are ecologically and whole and generous and loving. So that's aspirational, I suppose, but it's a hope.
Thank you. That's really good. Well, let me open it up to the room. What questions or thoughts do you have for Jeff and for one another? We have a microphone coming your way, Amanda.
I'm wondering, in trying to reframe the ultimate goal of the liberal arts as being more for changing communities rather than professional preparation, how you speak to low-income students and parents about that reframing and without causing anxiety that they may not find professional opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your chapel talk this morning, which I thought was very, very encouraging. Yeah, so that's a real challenge, right? And that's why I kind of gave that caveat at the beginning that this is admittedly a kind of contrarian move because so much work has been done about the economic benefits of a liberal arts education, and I don't think that's wrong. My concern is that if we begin and end the conversation there, we really distort the kinds of goods that the liberal arts tradition has and can continue to offer students. So I don't take those concerns from students or parents lightly. Especially, I teach English, one of these humanities things that apparently prepares you to be a barista. So I am not ashamed to cite, our graduates are gainfully employed, that you can get a job. But if you come here to get a job and you leave here to get a job, we will have failed you. So I don't try to, I don't know. You can tell me what you think works. In this Liberating Arts project that Aaron mentioned, we have a whole chapter on aren't the liberal arts unemployment? Won't they make you unemployable? And the contributor there plays a great case. No, but that's one chapter out of 10. So we want to say, I think it's helpful to kind of answer that concern, but then pivot and say, if that's your only concern, you could also get a different kind of preparation. But is that the person that you want to be? Do you want to imagine yourself do you imagine yourself merely as a member of an economy? Because I think you can maybe turn to theological vocabulary to talk about that's not how God imagines you, right? I think you can turn to community, social vocabulary to talk about members of communities. That's not how your relationships, the people who love you, imagine you. To say that this can be a facet of your identity, but it should not be your identity. So I guess I think it's a valid concern, needs to be addressed, but somehow we have to expand their imaginations so that that's not, because if we don't, we do them a disservice, and we reduce their value as human persons, right?
Here you go.
Thanks for an awesome talk. I wanted to bring up two kinds of institutions that are, related to liberal arts education. One is that, there are some schools that really incorporate the work of taking care of the school into the education, right? That part of the goal of being in school is to participate in the creation of the curriculum, the running of the facilities, and all of that. And then, there's also intentional communities where people decide, hey, we're going to live together in the long term, and together we're going to, manage everything that needs to be managed in order to live together. And I'm wondering, when you look to the future and you imagine what the future of education will be, do you see a place for sort of more hybridization of those kinds of things where, a place for an education could be a place where you could live in a more long-lasting kind of way, or in a more deeply embedded way while you're there, or what's the potential space for that as we look to the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought more about the whether it's the work college model or these kinds of institutions, and this also speaks to the concern about future, in that oftentimes those institutions that make students work more can then charge less. Students want all these amenities, and then colleges build them out, and they charge a lot more money, and then you have more debt, and then you have to get a good job to pay off your debt, so it's a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. If you can keep costs lower because students have, participate in the work of the community, then you can, maybe students feel the economic freedom to take courses and to engage in learning activities that don't have immediate career outcomes. So I think that's another benefit. But I'm really inspired by different models of small institutions, or sometimes institutions that are kind of embedded in research colleges, research universities, right? So the kind of living learning communities that have their own small communities, sometimes even their own curriculum, or at least the core curriculum, but then they can have the resources of a bigger institution. So I think that higher ed's going to have to get a lot, I hate the word innovation because it's so overused, but I think there is a sense that we need to maybe reimagine the possibilities, especially for undergrad education, to make it cheaper and to incorporate other kinds of formative educational experiences outside the classroom, like working together, like eating together, like taking more ownership for the life of the community. So I think absolutely, it's just hard to make those work right now and to show students their value. But I think with the big shuffle that's happening right now, there's going to be space for them, these new models, in a way that there has not been for decades. So I think it's a really hopeful possibility. Yeah.
Say more about what's making space.
The costs are getting so high, many people are thinking, is a college degree worth it? I don't know. In a way that wasn't true, I think, 10 years ago even. So because of that, I think more, paradoxically, right, more parents maybe are open to, well, I don't know if it's worth it spending $60,000 a year. So maybe my kid could do this for $20,000 a year, and maybe the piece of paper doesn't seem as valuable, whatever that means, but maybe that's okay. So that's my hope anyway.
Here you go, Eric.
Thank you. Hi. Again, thank you for your presentation and for fielding questions. A The question I have is about, during your talk you mentioned specialization still has a value, like you prefer your surgeon to know what they're doing, right? And I'd like to hear a little bit more about this, about the struggle about having it both ways. How do we advocate for a breadth of knowledge as a value while still valuing specialization, particularly in this notion of a capitalist-dominated, competitive-dominated, gotta get ahead, so start early, and if you want to be a successful specialized engineer, you're gonna need to do engineering as an undergrad first if you want to get into the good graduate school program in engineering and get a job that allows you to specialize and be, quote, successful. So how do you have both at the same time in the philosophy that you're advocating? I happen to agree with your philosophy, but I'm curious about what you would answer to that question from a parent of a prospective student.
And yeah, like usual, I'm just going to riff on Wendell here, and the Gospels. So I'll give you two different answers, one that's theological, one's not. The first, the theological one is, if you want to love your neighbor, you have to be able to actually help your neighbor, right? So I think to frame specialization not as a private good that enables you to get ahead, but rather as a good that enables you to actually effectively love your neighbor. You know, if you want to help your neighbor and your neighbor needs help, you got to know how to do stuff. And if you're incompetent, then you can't help your neighbor. So that's a way of valuing specialization, but I think it changes the narrative to be to see it in this context of generosity rather than in a context of the self. The other thing is, Barry likes to talk about the need to have both virtues and virtuosities, which I think is a related idea, but that you need to have a virtuosity, you need to have a particular skill, right? There's beauty in a specialized musician, a doctor, an engineer, someone who's just excels at their particular craft. That is a beautiful thing. And yet we all know the ways that these can go awry when they're taken out of the context of a virtuous life. And so trying to educate students to be both virtuous with the kind of moral character formation that makes for a good life, as well as to have particular specific virtuosities, particular specialized competencies that in that context of who they are as persons enable them to bless their communities. So I think you're absolutely right that a liberal arts education should not ever deny the goods of specialization. It's just trying to resituate those in their proper context.
How have you seen some of the things you're talking about be applied on the system of higher ed, particularly Grove City where you're at? What are the challenges of integrating, and wondering, like, what is space for imagination from a collective perspective, not individual? How does a space made for collective imagination with students to envision what this response to the good life might be?
Yeah, that's tough. Part of what I presented on today, I contributed to a conversation that we're having within our institution, Grove City, about as part of this long core curriculum review process. And that has been helpful. I think, one of the taglines of that process has been, how can we educate our students for whole-souled wisdom, and what does this kind of look like? And then, of course, it hits the fan when you get into, like, transferability, departmental staff, all the kinds of institutional issues. So it's very challenging, and yet I am heartened by the kind of earnestness with which my colleagues addressed the question. And it looks like, miraculously, our general education curriculum is actually going to expand. There's going to be an additional class in the humanities, in large part because we realized accurately, I think, that our students don't necessarily understand how all the required courses, this humanities core we have, how they fit together. It feels like just silos. So how can we tell a better story about this liberal arts education we're offering to our students, so that as they come in as freshmen and then as they leave as seniors, they will have a better sense of the arc that's we're trying to do for them. So, as you might imagine, certain majors that have these external accreditation factors or other issues that make them very large, it's difficult, right? Difficult conversations. But I think, with some exceptions, most people recognize the need to embed these professional majors in the liberal arts context, and through some persuasion and some conversations, have been okay with this expansion. So, it's really tough, I know, but I think part of it is coming back to what's our mission, what we're trying to do, and then how can we work through all the myriad of the details of a complex institution to better create that experience for our students. So, I mean, it's very complicated. Every institution is going to be different, but.
Hey there, thanks so much. This is a terrific talk. I have two questions, which I'll read, but I want to give you some context for the questions. So what I'm getting at here is the relationship between Christian higher education and churches. So in my experience, churches have understood God as the author of all creation, making all things worthy of our study. Churches have tended to view themselves not as businesses, but as institutions rooted in communities and committed to promoting human flourishing, rich friendships, healthy marriages, strong families, neighborly obligations, meaningful work, just societies, etc. Churches have tended to use the language of faithfulness rather than the verbiage of success. Churches have portrayed work as good and a blessing of God, but careerism as a small and inadequate God that has contributed in no small measure to the climate mess that we're in, to say nothing of being insufficient to help people address the big picture questions of meaning, value, purpose, truth, love, and more. So given that context, the questions I have are, do you see a role for churches in helping Christian colleges and universities realize this alternative view of liberal arts? And second, do you see a parallel between the decline of American church membership and the decline of a robust commitment on the part of Christian colleges and universities to a rich, broad, deep, and meaningful liberal arts curriculum?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's so important, Ben. I think, wow. Yes, I think that connection is really important, both in the problem, but also possibly some of the remedies. In that, okay, a couple of things. So one is, I think it's easier for me to convince a prospective student and his or her parents, it's often the parents, right, to kind of embrace this vision of liberal arts education if we share a common theological language. So oftentimes, I can have very kind of pragmatic, career-minded students and parents, but because of this vocabulary, that is my in. And without that, I honestly don't, it's really hard to have these conversations sometimes. So that's why I think Christian colleges in particular have an in, because if we don't lose sight of this liberal arts tradition that we're often a part of, we still have the opportunity to persuade people that maybe couldn't be persuaded if they didn't share these religious convictions. So I think we have to own that and leverage, use that common ground to make that case. However, I think that, as you put it, this kind of ecclesial identity is often weakening in American culture. And oftentimes, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but oftentimes the religious experience can get kind of privatized, and it can be just another kind of therapeutic thing that we do to make us, to help us feel good as we're also pursuing a career. And we become kind of career-oriented, consumer-oriented Americans who also do this church thing. And insofar as that happens, then I think it's harder for Christian liberal arts colleges to make the case. Then it often becomes easier to say, like, well, come here because we share your political convictions, or we'll be a safe place for your students to come here, or we'll be like a fun Christian camp atmosphere, right? So it's, again, other kind of appeals to students that maybe still treat them as individualized consumers. And to that extent, it's really hard to invite them into a kind of formative experience that might be uncomfortable, might challenge them, might change the kind of people that they are in a really robust sense. So that's why I think many Christian liberal arts colleges are struggling as well to articulate the educational vision they have. And so that's the challenge. And yet, as I started off with, I do think you're absolutely right that the possibility of this kind of common theological vocabulary that has all these goods that you named, right, is oftentimes the best place to start having these conversations. And to the extent that churches and different denominations are still involved in K through 12 education in a robust sense, then that often can be a place where Christian colleges or other liberal arts colleges can contribute, can encourage, and can help, and then have a student body who's already been kind of inculcated into this vision of higher education, and maybe require less persuasion to see its goods.
So I'm totally with you on the need for a core, and totally with you on the need to not oversell our institutions as places where our primary work is getting you a job when you get out of college. I'm with you totally. But I think you cheated us a little bit, because you asked us to think about what kinds of things we would like to have in the core. And 4 of us sitting at this table were pretty sure that we would not actually be able to come to consensus on that, even though we're at similar kinds of institutions and so on. And you cheated us a little bit also, because your own description of the way to do this is basically a great books course, which a lot of us would never be able to teach at our institutions, at least in the way that you described it, because it's insufficiently diverse, for one thing. Not that you guys would ever have arguments about that at Grove City. Sorry. We all read the higher ed press. It's okay. But also because really all of the things that you point to are kind of hero's journey kinds of texts, anti-heroes in some cases. And I think this is exactly what some of our minoritized students are trying to point out is a problem with our core, right? Patrick Reyes in this book, The Purpose Gap, which I think has made a pretty nice impact, has exactly this argument, right? He says for the kind of community that he comes from, those kinds of stories don't resonate because you, as a person from that community, you've never been and will not be in a position to resonate with those stories, right? And so I'm a little concerned about whether the kind of direction you're pointing us in is adequately attentive to those issues among our students who are increasingly diverse. I think someone said here at Westmont, somebody said this in one of the sessions, that he had gone from when he was undergraduate being like 10% people of color to now like almost being a majority institution. That's a huge shift in a couple of decades, and I'm just wondering whether you think the kind of core that you have in mind, not necessarily your one that you gave us the example of, but other descriptions of this can attend to that reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a complicated question. I'm going to answer your second question first and then dodge your first question. Because the second question I thought more about, this project I mentioned, this Liberating Arts project, one of the chapters is titled something like, "Aren't the liberal arts racist?" And that's an issue we have to address. However, I don't think that they are. I mean, so the person who wrote that contribution, Angel Adams Parham, has this also great book called The Black Intellectual Tradition that just came out. She does a really fabulous job, I think, of articulating the ways that, in practice, liberal arts this tradition has often been elitist and racist, and yet that's not inherent to the disciplines and the kind of habits of mind. And it has been inclusive, and we need to make it more so. So this is not like a resting on the laurels thing, but we don't have to throw out the goods to open it up to a broader audience. You can also think about somebody like Roosevelt Montas at Columbia, who teaches one of the last kind of great books models in a major university, and he makes a similar argument. So I think it's an issue, but I don't think it's impossible to open that story up. And I teach every semester when I teach my American Lit class, we read Frederick Douglass, and my students don't get all his references, right? Because he's read the whole Western canon. So I think there's ways of even approaching a kind of great book style, the kind of attention to texts, the sort of Socratic format, asking questions of ultimate purpose structured around common readings, that does not have to be exclusionary. even if historically that has been the case, right? But so not to dismiss the reality, but to really eagerly press into the possibility of making it more hospitable, I guess. That said, to your first question, I don't think the only way to do this is through a kind of great books model. I think that's one model. I think there are others. You know, there's the whole idea of a common core and different structures has been really creatively addressed in recent years. And I don't think that there needs to be one model. I would love to see different colleges offering different common cores. Because to me, that's part of what local adaptation means. It's part of what it means for a community to say, you know, what you're going to get here is different than a different place, but it's coherent within our community. You're going to have a common conversation amongst the people who live and share in this place. We're going to address it this way, and if you went somewhere else, you would get a different experience. And certainly there'd be overlap, but I don't think it needs to be a kind of cookie cutter sense that like here is the curriculum that every liberal arts institution needs to adopt. Oh my word. So I think it can be. I think the key is there has to be kind of a culture of buy-in that can structure a common conversation, and that will have across these institutions a lot of similar features, but maybe the curriculum and the methods they use will be pretty disparate.
Jim, one last question, and then we should probably move to our next event.
I was wondering if you could comment on the appropriateness of team-taught courses. When I taught at Grove City College about 50 years ago, we had team-taught courses. The religio-philosophic dimension of life, the scientific dimension of life, the creative dimension of life. And I just wonder if you can talk about whether you think that model still has life in any way, because obviously it's a place and a way for faculty to avoid deciding whether their department's going to get a course or not. It does place great demands on faculty. It forces faculty to integrate, and faculty don't like to do that either. It's amazing that we expect our students to do it, but we can't do it. And it costs money, and it requires course release from a departmental curriculum that's often tight. So I understand all those problems, having tried to shepherd them myself, but I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I was just talking to my dean at Grove City about this. I was advocating for it in this new core because the 3 times that I've had the chance to teach, team teach in my teaching career have been amazing. You know, I think students really wake up when they see people, both of whom they respect, vehemently disagree with each other, right? And I love it. And I think sometimes I have a hard time getting my students to disagree with me and really engage. And when they see me and a friend of mine, who they both respect, disagreeing, all of a sudden they realize, oh, we can do that too. So even if, you know, as much as anything else, it's a kind of modeling what intellectual inquiry looks like, and it's infectious. And I learn from it. You know, it's very scary, as you say, right? I don't control the syllabus to the same extent. I have to familiarize myself with readings and disciplines that I might not be familiar with. I have to be ignorant. I have to not know. I have to say, stop. I don't get that. Back up, explain to me, which some of the students might know more. But I think it's really, it's invaluable for how it models for students the reality that even people with PhDs after their name are still ignorant and still learning. So I think it's really important. However, as you said, it's these economic and personnel challenges. You know, if you come out of grad school and you're very specialized and you just want to research, maybe you don't want to. And even at a small college like Grove City, where a lot of us would like to, it's the kind of financial challenges of it. So to my mind, it's worth the sacrifice to make it happen. And I think there are ways to do it, but it's definitely an uphill battle sometimes.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Let's all thank Jeff again. A few program notes. We are moving from this